From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
By sanctioning Maduro, the United States makes clear our opposition to the policies of his regime and the support for the people of Venezuela, who strive to return their country to a full and prosperous democracy.
The Trump administration sanctions Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro as tensions escalate in Venezuela following a controversial vote to elect a new National Constituent Assembly. Earlier this morning, 2 opposition leaders were seized from their homes. Meanwhile, the director of the CIA hints the agency is working to push regime change. We'll host a debate. Then we look at rising tension on the Korean Peninsula.
I think people are pretty distracted right now by the Trump reality TV show that's going on. But under the radar, the U.S. government is barreling towards regime change in North Korea, and that's just not going to work. If you thought the Middle East was a disaster, get ready for the Korean Peninsula.
We'll speak to former Green Party presidential candidate Dr. Jill Stein, just back from a peace delegation to South Korea. We'll talk about Korea, Trump, voting integrity, and you know that famous photo of former National Security Advisor General Mike Flynn and Russian President Vladimir Putin at a dinner in Moscow? Well, Jill Stein is in that picture, too. We'll find out what happened. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House Monday fired Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci just 10 days after he was hired, capping a tumultuous week that saw Scaramucci repeatedly insult his colleagues in vulgar and sexually explicit terms. Scaramucci's departure came just days after Trump fired his White House rival, former Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, and less than 2 weeks after former Press Secretary Sean Spicer resigned in protest of Scaramucci's appointment. On Twitter, President Trump dismissed reports of turmoil within his administration, tweeting a boast about stock market and employment numbers and adding, "No White House chaos." This is Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders speaking at her press briefing Monday.
I think it's pretty simple. I've said it before. If you want to see chaos, come to my house with 3 preschoolers. This doesn't hold a candle to that.
Scaramucci was reportedly fired by General John Kelly just after the retired Marine Corps general was sworn in as Chief of Staff Monday. At the White House, President Trump praised Kelly over his brief tenure as head of the Department of Homeland Security.
This is our first cabinet meeting with General Kelly. He will be Chief of Staff. As you know, we all know him. We respect him, admire what he's done. And at Homeland, what he has done has been nothing short of miraculous. As you know, the border was a tremendous problem, and now close to 80% stoppage.
As head of DHS, Kelly has presided over major immigration and customs enforcement raids against undocumented immigrants. ICE has also been accused of specifically targeting undocumented activists for arrest and possible deportation. In Russia, State Department staff said Monday they were barred from retrieving their personal items from a property used by U.S. diplomats on the outskirts of Moscow as Russia's government struck back against a move by the U.S. Congress to ratchet up sanctions against Russia. President Vladimir Putin has ordered 755 U.S. staff to withdraw from the diplomatic missions in Moscow and elsewhere. Meanwhile, Russia said it will send up to 100,000 troops to the eastern edge of NATO territory by the end of summer and stepped up ongoing military maneuvers. The tensions came as Vice President Pence continued a tour of the former Soviet states, threatening retaliation against any Russian aggression. This is Pence speaking Monday at the headquarters of Estonia's defense forces.
President Trump has called on Russia to cease its destabilizing activities in Ukraine and elsewhere, and to cease its support for hostile regimes like North Korea and Iran. And under President Trump, the United States will continue to hold Russia accountable for its actions, and we call on our European allies and friends to do the same.
Vice President Pence later traveled to the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, where he promised U.S. support for Georgia's territorial integrity. In 2008, Russian forces invaded the Georgian regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Meanwhile, in Arizona, former Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio was convicted Monday of criminal contempt of court for defying a court order to stop his deputies from acting as immigration enforcement agents. Under the ruling by U.S. District Judge Susan Bolton, Arpaio could face up to 6 months in prison after a sentencing phase in October. The 85-year-old Arpaio said in a statement he would appeal the ruling and press for a trial by jury. Arpaio is a major supporter of Donald Trump, whose policies have included racial profiling and detaining immigrants in a scorching outdoor tent city jail, which Arpaio once referred to as his own concentration camp. In Los Angeles, California, longtime U.S. resident and father of 4, Romulo Avelica Gonzalez, faces deportation as soon as next week, despite a national campaign seeking his release after ICE immigration agents arrested him in late February. Video taken by Avelica Gonzalez's 13-year-old daughter, Fatima, shows her sobbing as her father was detained by ICE agents as he was driving her to school. Avelica Gonzalez lived in the United States for more than 2 decades. Immigration advocates fear his arrest signals a shift in ICE's long-standing policy against conducting enforcement activities at so-called sensitive locations like schools, churches, and hospitals. President Trump personally dictated a false and misleading statement attributed to Donald Trump Jr. about a meeting the president's son arranged with a Russian lawyer during the 2016 campaign. That's according to the Washington Post, which reported President Trump's decision to withhold important details about the meeting came over objections from his senior advisors, who wanted to provide a truthful account in case full details later emerged, the Washington Post reported. Donald Trump Jr. accepted the meeting after receiving an email from an associate describing it as an attempt by the Russian government to peddle information incriminating Hillary Clinton. The statement dictated by President Trump described the meeting as short and not focused on campaign-related issues, but on the issue of adoption. In Venezuela, 2 prominent leaders of the right-wing opposition, Leopoldo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma, were reportedly taken from their homes early this morning by security forces. Both men were already under house arrest. Their arrest came after the Trump administration announced new sanctions on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and branded him a dictator. Maduro claimed victory in Sunday's controversial election over whether to create a National Constituent Assembly, which the Venezuelan right-wing opposition says is an attempt by Maduro to further consolidate his power. The U.S. sanctions were announced at a White House press briefing on Monday by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster.
As a result of today's sanctions, all assets of Maduro subject to U.S. jurisdiction are frozen, and U.S. persons are prohibited from dealing with him.
Maduro is not just a bad leader. He is now a dictator. The United States stands with the people of Venezuela in the face of this oppression.
It's unclear if the U.S. will impose broader economic sanctions on Venezuela as the country suffers from high inflation and chronic food shortages. After Headlines will host a debate about the crisis in Venezuela. In Syria, convoys of buses have arrived near the Lebanese border ahead of a plan to exchange 9,000 rebels from the Nusra Front and their relatives for imprisoned members of Lebanon's Hezbollah militia, who support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The exchange came as heavy fighting continued to rage around the ISIS-held city of Raqqa in northern Syria. The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars reports a U.S.-led coalition leveled a home in Raqqa Friday, killing 15 members of the Al-Zana family, including 8 children. Air Wars also cited separate U.S.-led attacks in Deir ez-Zor that killed 5 civilians. In Iraq, Air Wars reports a U.S.-led assault killed 10 civilians from a single family Sunday when an airstrike hit their home in the town of Hawija. Air Wars cites a local source who reported the dead were mostly children. Meanwhile, Great Britain's High Court ruled Monday former Prime Minister Tony Blair should not face prosecution for leading Britain into the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The court's Chief Justice declared there was no crime of aggression in English law under which Blair could be charged. The ruling came despite a 2016 report that found Blair deliberately exaggerated the threat posed by Saddam Hussein in the lead-up to the war, and that intelligence agencies warned Blair that the invasion would increase the threat posed by al-Qaeda and other militant groups. In Saudi Arabia, authorities have freed prominent women's rights activist Mariam al-Otaibi from prison after she was held 104 days without trial. Al-Otaibi was arrested in April after she accused one of her brothers of domestic abuse, prompting her father to have her locked up on accusations of disobedience. At the time of her arrest, Otaibi was protesting the monarchy's harsh laws prohibiting women from participating in civic life and requiring women to travel with a male guardian outside the home. She was released Sunday without the permission of her family and without a male guardian present, as typically required by Saudi law. Her release was hailed by Saudi women's rights activists who drew attention to her plight with an online campaign using the hashtag #IamMyOwnGuardian. In Kenya, a senior election official was found murdered and bearing signs of torture Monday, just 1 week before Kenyans head to the polls for a hotly contested presidential election. Christopher Chegamasando, who was tasked with overseeing Kenya's electronic voting system, had been missing 3 days before his body turned up in Nairobi. The murder stoked fears of a repeat of violence after an election 10 years ago, which saw about 1,200 people die and more than 500,000 displaced and fighting among different ethnic groups. In Baja California, journalist Luciano Rivera Salgado was shot in the head at a seaside bar early Monday, becoming at least the 8th media worker killed in Mexico this year. It's not clear whether Salgado was killed because of his work as a journalist. Camera footage from inside the bar reportedly showed other patrons becoming angered when Salgado defended a group of women who were being harassed. The Committee to Protect Journalists has named Mexico the Western Hemisphere's most dangerous country for reporters. Back in the U.S., 2 protesters in Richmond, California, were arrested Monday outside the gates of a Kinder Morgan oil terminal as they locked themselves to oil barrels in a nonviolent protest against the company's plans to build a new Trans Mountain pipeline in Canada. The project would triple the capacity of an existing tar sands pipeline in British Columbia to 890,000 barrels per day. Opponents also want the company to halt shipments of tar sands oil to refineries in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is Richmond activist Andres Sota of Communities for a Better Environment.
The higher sulfur content leads to faster corrosion of steel that led to things like the explosion on August 6, 2012 here at the Chevron Richmond refinery. But also it creates more greenhouse gases and more particulate pollution. The greenhouse gases are destroying our atmosphere, and the particulate pollution is creating death and disease in our fence line communities like Richmond, California.
Monday's protests came as a new study found there's only a 1 in 20 chance the planet will avoid warming by at least 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. The study, published in Nature Climate Change, finds it's extremely unlikely countries will meet the goals set out by the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, especially since the Trump administration has promised to withdraw the U.S. from the deal. Meanwhile, a separate study published Monday by the University of North Carolina estimates climate change will cause 60,000 deaths globally in 2030 and 260,000 deaths by 2100. In Tennessee, 3 Cheatham County Sheriff's deputies are on administrative leave after video emerged showing them tasing an 18-year-old repeatedly while he was strapped in a restraint chair. The jailhouse video shows Jordan Elias Norris, who is arrested on marijuana and weapons charges, bound to the chair by the hands and feet, writhing in agony while the officers jab him in the ribs and electrocute him. One officer is heard telling Norris, "I'll keep on doing that until I run out of batteries," he said. Norris has filed a federal civil rights lawsuit saying he was left wanting to die as he was tortured for over 3 hours. Norris says he was left with more than 40 taser burns on his body. And in Washington, D.C., a police officer has been suspended after he wore a white supremacist T-shirt while on duty. The shirt shows a Grim Reaper holding a rifle with the Washington, D.C. flag attached to it. Above the flag are the words "Power Shift," which refers to the officers assigned to areas with high amounts of crime. On the O in Power Shift is the image of a type of cross that the Anti-Defamation League says is the same symbol used on a neo-Nazi website. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We turn now to Venezuela, where two prominent leaders of the right-wing opposition, Leopoldo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma, were reportedly taken from their homes early this morning by security forces. Both men were already under house arrest. This comes as tension is escalating in Venezuela after voters went to the polls Sunday to elect a new National Constituent Assembly, which will have the power to rewrite Venezuela's constitution. The right-wing opposition accused President Nicolás Maduro of attempting to consolidate his power. According to the official tally, at least 8 million people, or 40% of eligible voters, cast ballots Sunday despite an opposition boycott. On the same day as the vote, at least 10 people, including a candidate, died during widespread violence and protests. On Monday, the Trump administration placed sanctions on Maduro, barring all U.S. individuals and firms from doing business with him. This is National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster.
Maduro is not just a bad leader, he is now a dictator. The United States stands with the people of Venezuela in the face of this oppression. We will work with our partners to hold accountable all those responsible for the escalating violence and ongoing human rights violations. The president promised strong and swift actions if the regime went forward with imposing the National Constituent Assembly on the Venezuelan people.
On Monday night, Venezuelan President Maduro criticized the new U.S. sanctions.
Why am I being sanctioned? For facing fascism, hatred, and intolerance, for not letting Venezuelan oil and our natural wealth fall into the hands of the magnates who finance Mr. Emperor Donald Trump. That is why I am being punished, to defend the natural resources of Venezuelan land, which will never again fall into the hands of the U.S. imperialism. That is why I am being punished.
Well, to talk more about the situation in Venezuela, we're joined by two guests. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we're going to George Ciccariello-Maher. He's the author of Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela, as well as We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution. He teaches at Drexel University in Philadelphia, previously taught at the Venezuelan School of Planning in Caracas. And here in New York, we're joined by Francisco Rodriguez, chief economist of Torino Capital. He's the co-author of Venezuela Before Chavez, Anatomy of an Economic Collapse. Under Hugo Chavez, he headed the National Assembly's Economic and Financial Advisory Office. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with our guest here in New York. Francisco Rodriguez, can you describe what's happening right now in Venezuela?
Right. Well, right now in Venezuela, we have a political crisis, essentially. The government is deeply unpopular. The country has been hit by an economic crisis. Maduro's approval ratings have fallen. In the latest poll surveys, they come out below 20%. So he still has the support of about a fifth of the population. But however, most Venezuelans want him out, and as typically happens when you have such economic deterioration. So there are several constitutional procedures in the Venezuelan constitution whereby you could have, for example, early elections, a recall referendum. And the opposition tried to push for a recall referendum and was unable to do so. Some courts controlled by the government basically stopped the recall referendum last year. So the opposition has been calling for early elections or another way out of this. Instead of doing that, the government actually decided to press ahead with the Constituent Assembly. And the problem with the Constituent Assembly is that the government actually designed its own rules to elect the candidates and designed rules that were very biased in its favor. These rules, for example, gave an urban municipality with many voters the same number of representatives as rural municipalities where the government controls the majority of votes. It also allowed about a third of the delegates to be elected from lists of sectoral representatives, and it wasn't very clear where those lists were coming from. So the opposition decided to boycott the elections. And in fact, so turnout in this election turned out to be basically an indicator of the government's strength. The government claims that 8 million persons, the Electoral Council claims that 8 million persons came out to vote. That's not a very credible claim. We did some independent polling, exit polling, and we actually estimate there was about 3.6 million persons. In the last election that you had, the last kind of uncontested election in terms of the results that you had, Maduro got about 5.5 million votes. It'd be very difficult to believe that he's actually regained 2.5 million votes in the context of one of the deepest economic contractions in world history. Venezuelan GDP is now set to shrink by about 35–40% by the end of this year. That is the deepest economic contraction in Latin America, and it's the type of contraction that is typically seen only in countries that are undergoing wars.
Well, when you say that the 40% figure is questionable, I mean, were there, as an actual vote tally, isn't there a way to tell for sure whether that many people voted or not?
Well, no, there's no way to tell for sure in the sense that the Electoral Council is controlled by the government. There are 4 government representatives, 1 from the opposition. He actually was not present in the announcement, so we really have an announcement of a number of, well, there was a decision, by the way, by the opposition to boycott these elections, and that gives us an additional problem because the opposition didn't have witnesses. Typically, when you participate in an election, you have witnesses and you can contest the vote. The opposition didn't have that. So all that we have is an announcement of turnout by the government, and we really don't know how credible it is. What I can tell you is that we carried out some independent exit polling in order to try to assess what the turnout was, and we got a turnout figure of about 19%. And you know, if you think about it statistically, as with any polling, there's a confidence interval. So that number could have been 22, could have been 23, maybe it could have been 25. It couldn't have been 42. That's essentially statistically impossible.
Well, George Ciccarello, I'm wondering your assessment of what's been happening in the last few days, especially with this vote over the weekend.
So I think it's undeniable that Venezuela is in a deep and sustained economic and social and political crisis, which has more recently become an institutional crisis. Since the Venezuelan opposition took control of the National Assembly, you've really had this kind of deadlock within the institutions and a tit for tat between the executive judiciary and the National Assembly controlled by the opposition. And then this has been coupled with these sort of really violent street protests periodically through the last few years and over the past few months, taking more than 100 lives. And so we're talking about a situation in which the government was being asked to do something to help break out of this crisis. And this was one of the solutions that was put forward, or one of the possible solutions. In other words, to try to bring people to the table, to get people together, to work on a revision of the Constitution in a way that might help to break out of this crisis. And I think that's a very difficult prospect because the causes of the crisis are deep and are grounded in deep economic realities. But the goal of the government was to put forward a kind of legitimate process. And unfortunately, the refusal of the opposition to participate in this election, to boycott it, this is a strategy that has hurt them in the past, as with the 2005 National Assembly elections. And this time, what they're trying to do is to delegitimize the process entirely. In other words, an electoral process that they could have participated in, rather than attempting to move forward with more destabilization in the streets, which seems to be the chosen strategy of the opposition in the run-up to the next presidential elections next year.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that opposition because the reports that most of the commercial press here in the United States are showing of what's going on in Venezuela is of people protesting in the streets and scores of people being killed. But there's very little reporting on who is being killed and who is doing the killing. There are some reports out of Venezuela that as many as 20 people have been burned, have been publicly burned by opposition figures. I think the last one was Orlando Figuera on May 20th was burned in the streets as thought to be a Chavez supporter. What do you know about who is actually involved in this violence? Is it the government against the protesters, or is it in some cases the protesters against the Chavistas?
It's certainly both. Of these more than 100 deaths, those that we know the causes of, they're pretty evenly split. Some are dying at the hands of security forces. Others are being killed in and around the protest by protesters. These are often violent blockades in which people are not even able to get to work. And when they try to get to work, they're often attacked. And if you look too much like a Chavista, which is to say you look poor or you look dark-skinned, you're much more likely to be attacked. And in these really brutal cases recently, to be burned publicly, to be lynched. And you've also had these, this constant campaign of sniper attacks, which have cost several lives. You've had people attacked, police recently attacked with bombs. And so we're talking about really a battle in the streets. It's not a question of protesters simply being repressed by the government. It's a real battle in the streets in which the government is actually very hesitant often to use force because it knows it will be tarred as repressive. And so that's why these protests have gone on for so long. And if you ask many people in particularly in poor neighborhoods, they want the protests gone, and yet the government does not want to be too heavy-handed with these protests. So it's really been this long sort of political war of attrition in the streets, and it's something that requires a solution urgently so that we can get to discussing the real economic causes of the crisis and moving forward.
Would you agree with that assessment, Francisco?
Oh, I definitely think that there's a confrontation. I agree that the violence is not only one-sided. I agree that there's violence coming from the opposition. It's very difficult here to come up with tallies. And even, in the cases the other speaker was pointing out, there are snipers. I mean, what do we know about who these snipers are? Are they the opposition says that they're government snipers? The government says that they're opposition snipers. The reality is that when there is political violence of this type, you're not going to be able to find out what really happened until you have a truth commission, you have investigations, you kind of can understand the process that led to it. So I don't disagree with that characterization. I probably would disagree with the idea that the government has not been heavy-handed. I mean, the government has been, there are a lot of, well, there are allegations, of course, there are even very kind of serious allegations about torture, but there are things that the government has definitely not allowed, which would be allowed in a normal democratic society. The whole district of Libertador, which is the district of central Caracas, is a district in which opposition demonstrations cannot occur. So the government does not allow, it allows the demonstrations to occur in the region of Miranda because there's an opposition governor there, so they have less authority. But once they get into Caracas, which is where the government buildings are, they don't allow them to come to go into the city. Is it true that sometimes the protests have turned violent? Yes. It's also true that generally in a democracy and in any well-functioning society with some type of rights of expression, people should be able to demonstrate before government buildings. They should be able to demonstrate that they are against the government. People in Venezuela don't have the right to do that. And I think that the concern is not just a concern of security. I think that there are very serious limitations that are being put on Venezuelans' political rights. But I would get back to the basic issue, which is that the basic limitations come on Venezuelans' electoral rights. The fact is that Venezuelans had the right to decide whether they wanted to revoke their president according to the Venezuelan Constitution. When President Hugo Chavez faced that type of contest in 2004, he said, I'll go to the referendum, and he won the referendum. So people voted in favor of Chavez. But in the case of Maduro, he has not allowed the referendum to go through. And all of the pretexts that have been put for that are really very poor. There's just nothing even resembling a normally coherent argument about why it was that the referendum was stopped. The government alleges that there was fraud in the collection of signatures, but they point to signatures which were allegedly fraudulent, which had already been accepted from the tally, and there were enough signatures, even excluding the presumed fraudulent signatures, in order to get the process to go forward. But nevertheless, the government stopped it because there's a reality, and this is something that I don't think anybody would contest right now. Maduro would lose a presidential election. The government would lose an election right now, according to every single poll. I mean, the polls that in the past said that Chavez would win now are saying that Maduro would lose by a 3-to-1 margin, by even a 4-to-1 margin. And the government knows that, and that's why the government doesn't want to hold elections. But once we get to restrictions on the ability to elect your leaders, we're really talking about a backbone of what we understand as democracy.
George Ciccarello, would you agree with what Francisco Rodriguez is saying?
Well, it's a very quick slide between the ability to recall your leaders, which I agree is actually one of the hallmarks of the Bolivarian process and a sort of a rare phenomenon in the world. Slide from that and the ability to elect your leaders. There's never been any kind of restriction on the ability to elect a Venezuelan leader. What there has been is an expansion of electoral rights and electoral freedoms and the ability to participate in more direct ways in recalling leaders. And I would like to have seen a recall referendum. The opposition was very half-hearted when it put forward the proposal proposal and has not pushed it entirely. And the Supreme Court, of course, not Maduro, but the Supreme Court stopped that process on the basis of these claims of fraud. But the reality is you don't slide from that into saying that you've got some kind of dictatorship when I can't recall President Trump, when you've got several leaders in Latin America who are less popular than Nicolás Maduro. And no one is asking when we can recall Enrique Peña Nieto in Mexico. No one is asking or referring to the leaders of various other countries as dictators simply because their term has not been completed, and Maduro's term is completed next year. There will be elections. Any constitution and any constitutional reform that comes out of this assembly will go to a public vote. And so we're talking about a country that's had more elections, more verified, clean elections than really anywhere else on earth in the past 15 to 20 years. And it's really difficult to hear anyone, and much less the Trump regime, refer to this as a dictatorship.
We're going to go to a break, then we're going to come back to this conversation. George Ciccariello-Maher is with us, Drexel University in Philadelphia. Francisco Rodriguez is with us here in New York, chief economist at Torino Capital, co-author of Venezuela Before Chavez, Anatomy of an Economic Collapse. This is Democracy Now! Back with them in a minute. Singing from their latest album, Tastes Like L.A., here in our Democracy Now! Studios. To see the full interview and performance, go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as we continue to talk about the situation in Venezuela, I want to turn to CIA Director Mike Pompeo, talking about Venezuela last month at the Aspen Institute.
Anytime you have a country as large and with the economic capacity of a country like Venezuela, America has a deep interest in making sure that it is stable and as democratic as possible. And so we're working hard to do that. I'm always careful when we talk about South and Central America and the CIA. There's a lot of stories. So I want to be careful with what I say. But suffice to say, we are very hopeful that there can be a transition in Venezuela, and the CIA is doing its best to understand the dynamic there so that we can communicate to our State Department and to others. The Colombians, I was just down in Mexico City and in Bogota week before last, talking about this very issue, trying to help them understand the things they might do so that they can get a better outcome for their part of the world and our part of the world.
That was CIA Director Mike Pompeo talking at the Aspen Institute last month. So the United States, so he's been going around Latin America talking with key leaders there about what to do about Venezuela. Francisco Rodriguez, your sense of the role of the United States in all of this, because we always seem to be portrayed as an observer rather than as a participant in the process.
Well, the U.S. has taken a pretty active role and, to a certain extent, a unilateral position in the sense that the U.S. has been pushing for very strong sanctions on Venezuela. And they've imposed sanctions on leaders. Well, of course, we know from yesterday the sanction on President Maduro. It's more than anything symbolic, but they've also imposed sanctions on a number of Venezuelan government officials. This is a policy that comes from the Obama administration. And now there's some discussion in the administration about imposing economic sanctions on Venezuela, maybe an oil embargo. I mean, all of these things appear to be on the table, and even though they haven't been announced yet, they are under discussion. The U.S. has also been coordinating with other countries in order to try to make these sanctions at least a bit multilateral. So on the sanctions that were imposed on government officials, these are sanctions basically not allowing U.S. firms, either persons or individuals, to do business with them, and they have the effect of freezing the accounts that they would have in the U.S. There were announcements by Panama, by Colombia, by Mexico that they would collaborate with those sanctions, and that they would enforce them, that in fact they would also freeze the accounts of those individuals. So the idea is to cut off the money in the accounts of, up until now, individuals in government, but this is something that could extend to PDVSA, which is the firm that generates most of the nation's revenue. And I think that it could have a pretty serious effect on the Venezuelan economy.
And George Ciccarello, your response to this Pompeo, the words of Pompeo and the U.S. role, especially the CIA?
I mean, I think it's entirely unsurprising, and it is a continuous role. I mean, this is not something that really changed dramatically under Obama, from Bush through Obama and into Trump. What we've seen is a desire to have an active role in removing Chavista government from power. The question has just been how to do so most effectively. There was a coup in 2002 backed by the Bush administration, and it failed. It was a kind of a disaster for the opposition politically. And so then the Obama administration continued to fund those very same coup leaders, continued to fund people involved in that coup and right-wing anti-democratic elements, and to do so openly. And so it's no surprise to see this happening now, and to see the CIA expressing its open desire to be involved, because this has been the role for so long. And I think any question of sanctions is really only going to help Maduro. It's only going to help stabilize politically the legitimacy of the Maduro government, in part because being attacked by the United States is really only burnishes the credentials of someone as an anti-imperialist, but also to be attacked by someone with such low moral credibility as President Trump is really a gift to any political leader, because you're being attacked by someone with no credibility and really no ability to say anything about anyone, much less Nicolás Maduro.
George Ciccarello, what about the arrests last night of Leopoldo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma? Both were under house arrest, but we see the video in both their cases of them being taken out of their homes by, I guess it's Venezuelan intelligence.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize and to remember that these people were under arrest. They had been shifted to house arrest. They've been charged with a number of things, from conspiracy to inciting violence in the streets, and they represent really the conservative right-wing fringe of this opposition movement. Now, whether whether the evidence is there for them to continue to be held or to be convicted, to have been convicted, is a question. But they've been charged with serious crimes, and I think the category of political prisoner is used very broadly in Venezuela to apply to things that people would be in prison for in many other places. And these are people who have been involved in, undeniably involved in the coup, and undeniably involved in mobilizations in the streets that have turned violent and have continued to encourage these mobilizations. And so I think it's really no surprise to see this happen right now. I'm not sure that it's going to help the political situation at all, but it's not quite as simple as the narrative that's being put forward of people being grabbed and seized out of their homes. These are people who are under arrest, in one case convicted. And so we need to be very clear when we're talking about what's going on. But moving forward, the question is really going to be how to deal with these questions, how to get people together to discuss this situation. And I'm not sure that that these kind of actions in the middle of the night are going to help the opposition come to the table.
And also briefly, could you talk about the criticism of Maduro from the left, not just from the right, that there are some folks formerly part of the Chavista revolution, for instance, Luisa Ortega, the Attorney General, who has now become an outspoken critic of the current policies of the Maduro government. Could you, what's the nature of the criticism from the left?
Sure. I think there are a wide range of what you could understand to be critics, left-wing critics of the Maduro government. Some of these figures, of course, that you've heard about, but also, I think more importantly, on the grassroots level, we need to be very clear about the fact that this is a revolutionary process that has brought in a great range of participatory social movements and revolutionary grassroots organizers. But for the most part, these are people that have not broken with the government, but are really trying to push and figure out a way to press the government to the left, to encourage a renovation of the commitment to grassroots democracy. These are people who organize in these things that are called communes, where people are directing managing the production on the local level and local grassroots democracy, and trying to figure out a way to leverage this government, to press it to the left, and to do so in a very difficult situation of crisis in which Maduro has been erratic, to be perfectly clear. On the one hand, supporting grassroots organizers, supporting this sort of ferment at the grassroots level, while trying to stabilize the political and economic system in ways that really that are really distasteful, I think, to many, turning to foreign capital, turning to foreign corporations for investments. And so there's this tense contradiction that's going on amid this crisis, and many on the left are dissatisfied, of course. Many Venezuelans are certainly dissatisfied with the state of the economy. And so, you know, the question is really how to stabilize the economy, how to move forward, and how, from the perspective of these left-wing sectors, how to deepen this process, how to, you know, create a situation in which Venezuela can become more socialist, not less, and not turn back simply to the old neoliberal capitalism that failed in the past.
And Francisco Rodriguez, how you think the country should move forward? I mean, you're a former Chavista. You were head of the national budget, the Congressional Budget Office under Chavez.
I was appointed with the support of both parties, actually. It was a bipartisan appointment. I was appointed by unanimity of the National Assembly back in 2000, yes.
But are fiercely critical of Maduro right now. How do you...
I'm critical. I'm critical of Maduro's economic policies. I actually participated in an attempt last year led by UNASUR to try to advise the Maduro government in order to improve economic policies. There were a set of recommendations that were handed to the administration. And as a Venezuelan, definitely the first thing that I want to see is for my country to be able to address these deep economic issues. I mean, there has been a very serious deterioration in living standards. There have been increases in, for example, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, indicators of hunger, body weight loss. I mean, there are a number of things that are really going wrong in Venezuela. And I think that there are changes in economic policy that could be carried out in order to address these issues. I mean, for example, Venezuela has a completely dysfunctional exchange rate system. The government sells dollars at an exchange rate of 10 bolivars per dollar. Nevertheless, in the black market, these are sold for over 10,000 bolivars per dollar. So the government is trying to maintain a completely unrealistic price of foreign currency, and that just generates an incentive for corruption. There are completely excessive controls on any type of economic activity in Venezuela, on just a basic price-setting mechanism. There haven't been any mechanisms. Well, nothing was done in order to save during the oil boom. So the country, when oil prices started going down, basically didn't have international reserves. It didn't have anything to use as a buffer on the way down as other countries. There have been a lot of errors in terms of economic policy. There's still things that could be fixed that could make things better.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Of course, we'll continue this discussion. Francisco Rodriguez, chief economist of Torino Capital, co-author of Venezuela Before Chavez, Anatomy of an Economic Collapse under Hugo Chavez. He headed the National Assembly's Economic and Financial Advisory Office. George Ciccariello-Maher is professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia. His books include Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela, and We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll look at what's happening in Korea and here at home with a former presidential candidate, Green Party presidential candidate, Dr. Jill Stein. Stay with us. Here on Democracy Now!, Las Cafeteras, performing in Democracy Now! Studios. To see the whole interview and all of their songs, you can go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we turn now to the Korean Peninsula, where tensions are again escalating between the U.S. and North Korea. On Friday, North Korea tested an intercontinental ballistic missile that experts say may be capable of reaching the west coast of the United States. North Korea says the test was a warning to the United States to stop imposing sanctions against North Korea. In response to the test, the U.S. flew 2 B-1 bombers over the Korean Peninsula and again tested its Alaska-based THAAD missile defense system. The U.S. has deployed a similar THAAD missile defense system to South Korea despite objections from local residents.
Joining us now and former Green Party presidential candidate Dr. Jill Stein. She just returned from a peace delegation to South Korea that was sponsored in part by the Task Force to Stop THAAD in Korea and Militarism in Asia. Dr. Jill Stein was the Green Party's presidential nominee in 2016 and 2012. Welcome back to Democracy Now!
Great to see you.
Talk about what you found in South Korea.
It's a pretty amazing situation. South Korea just had what they call their candlelight uprising. They just impeached a very corrupt and conservative president, and now they have really turned their candlelight uprising, which continues to focus on the impacts of militarism, of nuclear weapons, and the THAAD missile system. And they are calling for a peace treaty with North Korea. You know, the Korean War essentially is not over. There's been an armistice, but the peninsula has lived under threat of war. Recently, North Korea has been firing off the second ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, which is a very powerful and fast missile and is very frightening to other countries around the world. And they've also now developed their nuclear weapons capability. And you know, it's been this accelerating set of provocations now. North Korea has done this in the setting where the U.S. has been doing nuclear bomb mock runs, mock attacks with nuclear weapons for decades, actually. And we also have a policy of a first strike of a nuclear attack against North Korea. So understandably, North Korea has felt like they have to develop a nuclear weapon in order to, you know, stand a chance. So that's where we are. It's dangerous. It's very dangerous because Seoul, a city of 25 million people, is in the crosshairs of this conflict, and even a limited exchange of nuclear weapons could result in nuclear winter, which would, you know, in turn is predicted to cause hundreds of millions of deaths around the world. So this is a conflict we all have a stake in, and it's not rocket science about how to fix it. The North Koreans, the Russians, and the Chinese have all been very clear about what they want, which is essentially a freeze on the war games, this threatened nuclear attack from the U.S. in exchange for a freeze on their nuclear and their missile program.
Well, you mentioned the changing political situation in South Korea, which gets very little attention here in the United States. Is it your sense that there's a possibility for the South Korean government to take independent action in terms of moving forward on diffusing the tensions with the North? And if so, is the Trump administration's, a lot of the bellicose nature of its pronouncements now really predicated to trying to stop any kind of reconciliation between the South and the North?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Trump administration seems to be doing what it knows how to do, which is to basically sell weapons and drum up conflicts in order to do that. You know, they seem pretty clueless about how to proceed, and with the chaos going on in the White House, you know, it's questionable what they can do. But there are saner voices that are beginning to be heard right now. The New York Times had an editorial this morning actually calling for negotiations. James Clapper himself has really come out quite strongly in favor of what they call a freeze for a freeze. Freeze the war games and in exchange for North Korea freezing its weapons program. And there are others. We've done this before. Negotiations have actually worked in the past. During the mid-90s, we were able to freeze for a period of about 8 years the weapons development program by sitting down and talking with North Korea. And then George Bush came in with his evil, you know, his axis of evil, and actually at that point instituted a first strike nuclear policy against North Korea. So, and destroyed the trust and the negotiations. But we need to go back to that. It's like the Cold War, all over again. We need to relearn those lessons. Right now, the instincts are to basically fire up the missiles and bring in more of them. It's absolutely a disaster. I should mention the THAAD missile defense system, because this is very provocative to China. It's like we're taking the regime change paradigm from the Middle East and we're trying to apply it here on the Korean Peninsula. And if you think it was a disaster in the Middle East, now add nuclear weapons and China and Russia, this isn't going to work, which is why I mentioned the nuclear winter thing, because we're heading towards a mushroom cloud right now. This is not like your regime change in the Middle East, which has been catastrophic enough. This is really on a nuclear dimension now, so it just cannot go forward. And saner voices
even
need
the
to
new
prevail.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in is against the THAAD missile system. Didn't even know that some new equipment was just brought into his own country when it came to THAAD, and called for immediate negotiations with North Korea. What happened?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the people of South Korea are really disturbed about this, and there are really strong demonstrations going on against him now, and it's felt like he's really betrayed the people, because he was very clear as a candidate that he supported
but he called for
a peace
this
treaty.
as president.
That's right. Well, initially as president, he did oppose THAAD, and then he's done a real turnaround ever since his summit with Donald Trump. He's really backed off. So, I think what's exciting now is that there is sort of an international coalition that's developing among the peace and democracy groups between South Korea and the U.S., and we're really both trying to work at both ends of the problem, and to get the U.S. to back off, and likewise to get South Korea to stand up for sovereignty. It has been essentially an occupied peninsula. It's been a battleground, actually, of the great powers for the last century, initially occupied by Japan, then, by Japan throughout the Second World War, and then immediately occupied by the Soviet Union and the U.S.
And your sense
they
of
pay the price.
Your sense when you were there in South Korea of how people regard the role of China, because the Trump administration never stopped saying China's got to step forward, China's got to step forward, and now, of course, is saying China has failed to step forward. The role of China in this, because China continues to reject the U.S. Approach to dealing with North Korea.
That's right. I mean, China objects to the effort to isolate and punish North Korea. They don't want to see North Korea destroyed. They're not crazy about Kim Jong-un either, it appears, but they don't want a failed state on their border. They also don't want the U.S. or a U.S. client state on their border either. So they're very committed to preserving North Korea, and they're going to do that. The people of South Korea really want to get rid of the THAAD anti-missile system, because they see it as very provocative to China. They want to be left alone to deal with their relations in North Korea, and they have a very concrete sense of how they can begin a process. They had an economic development joint program with the North Koreans. They want to be able to go back to that. They want to be able to take a step-by-step approach, starting with the negotiations for a peace treaty.
Well, President Trump said this week when asked about North Korea, it will be handled, we handle everything. Right. So I want to take that to the larger sense of the Trump administration as he handles everything. Your assessment of that as a person who ran against him.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is a symptom of a very sick political system. What we see going on in the White House right now, hearing, I think it was yesterday, you reported, I think, on your program that Lindsey Graham is now instructing President Trump that if he continues to harass Jeff Sessions or tries to get rid of him, that essentially what he was saying is that, get ready for impeachment hearings. And, to hear that from staunch Republicans, that they're actually threatening him now. Lindsey Graham is also, writing a bill to stop Trump from dismissing Mueller at the FBI. So, people really get that Trump is a liability. He's a disaster. You know, the sparks flying out of the White House now with the dismissal of the chief of staff and you know, the incredible comments of the communications director. Talk about, you know, communications. You couldn't have a worse example of how not to do communications. You know, they've really become the laughingstock of the world, and not just the world, even, you know, in the U.S. And I think they're becoming a big liability to Republicans. So, you know, I think Donald Trump is very clearly digging his own grave. He's been a lame duck president since the beginning. He's you know, passed absolutely nothing. He remains a grave danger because of what the president can do, especially around the military. But, you know, he does seem to be on his way out now, which is a wonderful thing. At the same time, you know, remember, he got elected by supporters who were not so much voting for him as they were voting against Hillary Clinton and the neoliberal legacy of the Democrats that have also been throwing people under the bus. So I think, you know, the bottom line is that we are in a very unstable and transitional political moment. People are looking for something else. The Democratic Party has not been able to step up to the plate and do a real kind of internal self-assessment. So, you know, I think it's an open book right now as to where it goes. It's potentially a very liberating moment. The Democratic Party's been trying to reform itself at least since the realignment movement of the 1960s and 1970s. It hasn't gotten there, and the efforts to reform the DNC, you know, didn't work. Nancy Pelosi is still staying the course against single-payer health care. This would be a perfect time for the Democrats to be pushing it forward. You had the majority of Democrats in the House that actually supported an even bigger military budget than what Donald Trump is supporting. So we need a political change, and you know, I think you know, stay tuned and hold on to your hat.
I wanted to ask you about that famous photo that is the bane of Trump's existence. The former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and the Russian President Vladimir Putin together in 2015 at a dinner in Moscow. You also, Jill, were at that dinner, and you were actually in that photograph at that head table. So, to say the least, you had a bird's eye view. What were you doing there?
So I was there actually to deliver one of the main messages of my campaign, which is that war has failed in the Middle East and that we need a peace offensive consisting of a weapons embargo and a freeze on the funding, the bank accounts of those countries that are sponsoring terrorism. At the time, Russia had just begun to bomb Syria. And my message was that Russia was following in the disastrous footsteps of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
But how did you end up at that table? This is the head table?
That's right. I knew I was going to be at the head table. All of the foreign diplomats were seated at the head table. Unfortunately, there was no interpreter at the head table, and there were no introductions made. Vladimir Putin came in.
And this was a celebration of 10 years of Russia Today.
Well, it was a celebration, but it was also a conference, and there was media there actually from all over the world, including U.S. media, and Canadian, you know, Chinese, et cetera. It was a real chance to lift up a different point of view about U.S. foreign policy, as well as Russian foreign policy, to a broader audience. On that same trip...
So you didn't get a chance to talk with Putin then?
Not a word. I was hoping to deliver my message to Putin, but there was no interpreter. He walked in with a group of people that I thought were his bodyguards. It turns out they actually were his head of communications, his chief of staff, et cetera. But you wouldn't have known it. I spent the evening, well, I spent the dinner talking to the German diplomat to my right. He was the only person who spoke English that was in earshot of me. And, you know, my
your assessment of what has been made of that, and of course, ultimately, Mike Flynn was forced out as National Security Advisor.
Yes. Well, you know, bear in mind that Mike Flynn has many contacts to Russia, and in fact was paid $40,000, which he accepted from the Russian government. I wasn't paid a penny, and I declined sponsorship for my transportation, my room, and my board. So, you know, I went there absolutely without any conflicts of interest or encumbrances. You know, but it's like nothing happened at that dinner. Nothing happened at that dinner. Michael Flynn has his own issues going on with Russia. You know, I can say that for my own part, that picture circulates without a single fact. I was there with a number of peace advocates who unfortunately, we have to turn to Russian TV and to Democracy Now!, but there are very few TV stations that cover peace candidates. I was there with Rocky Anderson and Ray McGovern.
The former mayor of Salt Lake City.
Yes.
So we're going to do part 2 of this discussion, and we're going to post online at democracynow.org. Jill Stein, the 2016 presidential nominee for the Green Party, just came back from South Korea. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our website's democracynow.org. Special thanks to Mike Burke, Tina Guster, Nermin Shea, Carla Wells, Laura Gottesdiener.